Well, hello, everyone. I'm Margaret Murphy, the Associate Vice President of External Affairs at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this live discussion of the documentary, Sustainable Futures, Communities in Action. The film looks at 4 different communities in different parts of the globe and how the people in the communities find power in dealing with the challenges of food, environment, and livelihood. I'm going to make some introductions. Each presenter will speak about 5 to 7 minutes, and we have 4 today. And then we'll move on to a question and answer portion. So, our first presenter, Tony Charles, Senior Research Fellow in Environment and Sustainability, a professor at both the School of Environment and our School of Business at St. Mary's University, and the director of the Community Conservation Research Network behind this film that we're going to see today. Our second presenter, Dawn Duchesne, is the executive producer and owner of Nexus Media, with decades of experience in documentaries about the environment, Indigenous communities, and democracy. Our third presenter is joining us today from Cape Town, South Africa. Merle Selman is Associate Professor and Head of the Department of Environmental and Geographical Sciences at the University of Cape Town. Her expertise includes integrated coastal management, governance of small-scale fisheries and coasts at risk, social justice, and marine protected area management. No surprise, she's a team member of the Community Conservation Research Network. Our fourth presenter, Nico Waldeck, is at Lambert's Bay on the northwest coast of South Africa. He's a community activist and advocate for small-scale fishers, uniting them, building national organizations, writing policy for small-scale fishing, and working on court challenges for small-scale fishing. That's all part of his background. Currently, he's with Abelobi, an NGO empowering small-scale fishers through technology. I'd also like to present our moderator for the question and answer portion of today's event. Libby Dean is a research associate with the Community Conservation Research Network, and she'll be monitoring the questions and answers. So when we get to that stage, and you can already start to post your questions, please use the question and answer feature on Zoom at the bottom of your screen view. We're going to reserve the chat feature to post resources related to this film for you, our attendees, and we're going to encourage you to enter questions during the presentations as they occur to you. If you want, you could also add your location or your region, where you're from, and if you wish to add your angle of interest. And that'll help us address your questions and highlight some of the appropriate resources. So now, I'm going to turn things over to Tony Charles as our first presenter. Tony.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret, and thank you to everyone for joining us here today. As Margaret said, I've been leading an organization called the Community Conservation Research Network for the last 8 years, roughly, and several people on this group today are part of the CCRN. We've been exploring for those years the connections of local communities engaging in stewardship of the environment and sustaining their local economies and livelihoods. We've been looking at 30 different places around the world, and very excited to be pulling together our knowledge base, and not just as researchers, because the CCRN is not a although it's based at St. Mary's University, it's not an academic kind of organization. It involves Indigenous organizations and participants, community-based organizations, governments, NGOs, environmental organizations, and so on. So it's really a broad-based kind of initiative. And so this film, which we released just a few days ago, is a key element of the work of the CCRI, and we're trying to reflect in the film that basic idea that we've been exploring for those years, and which has its roots long ago. You know, we're not discovering the idea of community-based conservation. We're really building on the knowledge base that's come over the years. Again, not just from researchers, but from actual practice around the world. And you know, one of the best known cases, for example, is in the Pacific Islands, and one particular individual, Bob Johannes, is known for work on documenting the local conservation activities in the Pacific Islands. In addition, Elinor Ostrom, who won a Nobel Prize for her work in looking at the commons and how local communities can actually conserve their local environment. Elinor Ostrom's a famous name in working on this sort of effort, and that's something that's been built on by thousands of people since then, and people in the field, in communities around the world that are solving their local environmental challenges, or at least attempting to solve them. It works better if they have the support of governments in what they're doing, if they're empowered to do that. So that's the sort of insights that we've been building up through this effort. So the film is one of the outputs, I guess, from our network activities. We also held, along with IUCN almost exactly 2 years ago, a major conference and gathering that featured in particular a large representation of Indigenous communities from around the world to really pull together some of the ideas here. The film, I should point out, on this particular event today, we're going to be focusing on the making of the film, the ideas in the film, and the issues underlying the film. This is not a session that features people from the particular communities that are focused on in the film. That will be a future event. This one is really looking at the film and the underlying issues, and we are very pleased, as Margaret introduced, that we have two people from South Africa that are able to focus in on one of the particular cases in the film. So I really am very pleased that you're able to join us for this initiative, and this perhaps won't be the last time in this 1 hour session that I'm going to mention that there are many other resources as well on the CCRN website, communityconservation.net, that you might like to have a look at it. Other films, short videos, animations, and various community stories that give an idea in more detail of some of those other locations around the world that just didn't fit into this particular film. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony. And Tony did speak about the making of the film. So now we're going to go to our next presenter, Dawn Duchesne, who of course is the head of Nexus Media, to talk about just that. Dawn, over to you.
Okay, I guess I'm more comfortable being on the other side of the camera, but here I am. So I was trying to think of what I could say that might be relevant to some of you who are listening in or watching in, I guess. And I really couldn't, I can't imagine how to do that because I can't see any of you and I'm not quite sure who I'm talking to. So I'm just going to take a guess at it instead of, and go for it. So this particular project meant a lot to me. I had been working, as Tony and as Margaret has mentioned, that I've been working in the area of making films about democracy, about community life for sure, about the fisheries in particular. Quite often I found myself doing work in that area. But it was really this film presented an opportunity to do a couple of things. One thing was it was a chance to consolidate a sort of spotted information, because I was really nested at a place of learning, St. Mary's University, in particular Tony. I couldn't have asked for a better guide through a fairly complex and sort of intricate world. So I felt privileged to have that access and that opportunity, and still do, to be honest. The second thing was that most films, I would be present when the film was being shot. So typically what would happen is that you put together the budget for the film, and with that budget you allocate resources that would enable you to visit the locations where you want to go. In this particular case, that wasn't possible. We just simply didn't have the money to do that. So we had to come up with an idea which would allow us to film in remote locations different from, and quite far away from where we were, and to somehow do that in a way that was authentic. And I don't think that was an easy thing to do. So that's what we set out to do, and we had to really work through proxies, and we had to be fairly careful that the people that we chose were the locations that we chose to work in were able to communicate with us effectively, so that we could put in motion what I like to think of as an iterative process, where we begin with an idea, we test the idea out somewhere, get feedback, the idea changes, and so you move along and together sort of work toward a conclusion. And that process really takes a lot of communication. So communication was central to the outcomes that you're seeing in the film. So anyway, so you'll have to be the judge about whether we succeeded or not. I think that the film does succeed, and I think the interesting thing about the film is that we were looking at 4 different locations, and it was a chance to see whether there was some patterns, and if something sort of appeared that was an obvious thing that all those communities shared. And I think the thing that they all did share and do share is that that the communities are better served when they are in charge of their own ideas and can set their own course. And I think that showed up over and over again, and that the role of the central government really is one of support and of nurturing and being there when that's necessary. So as a producer working remotely, this was an interesting challenge for me, because my situation was not unlike a government that has the opportunity to listen or not listen. So it was a central problem, I think, in the film, or a central idea of the film, to not betray the ideas that we were putting forward as good ideas for community life. So that was a challenge, and we tried, that's all I can really say, that we tried hard to listen and to be responsive and absolutely respectful of the people that were giving us their time and giving us their stories. So, and the stories, incidentally, again, another filmmaking thing is that it's a lot easier to make a film if you write a script beforehand. Almost any film that you're looking at would have a film script that is your guide, and your way to kind of navigate through the various things that happen in the process. And in fact, we did have sort of that situation, because CCRN had already collected stories, had already built a network of people, had already built confidence, really. So we were able to kind of piggyback the work that had already been done over the past 5 to 7 years, which was a great asset, and I think made things possible to do. So once we set out to do the film, the next problem was how do you go about getting footage from a place that you cannot visit? So how are we going to do that? And so our first attempt was to find filmmakers or shooters that we could work with in the locations. That didn't work out very well, and we had to come up with a different way of doing it. So it was an interesting kind of challenge, and I sort of tapped into my many years in this business. I was able to find people that I knew had been to near locations or were available to us to do that, to go there. And we were very lucky to find two women who were shooters for us. one in South Africa and one in Thailand. And the one who shot in South Africa and Thailand for us, well, I knew that she was shooting in India, and I asked her if she'd be interested in making a side trip on her way home, and she agreed. So Thailand was visited on the way home, so it added to her shooting agenda, and it was she that recommended a shooter in South Africa. So that worked out well for us. And the other thing I really have to say is in both locations, the support from the CCRN members was central, and we would not have had a prayer of a chance really without that support. So it all kind of came together in a very interesting way. And then Canada was where we could actually visit the locations. One of them was right here in Nova Scotia, so that was no problem. The other was on the west coast of British Columbia, which was a bit of a problem. It's a fair distance to get to British Columbia from Nova Scotia, but we were able to shoot there, and I was able to be there, so that worked out fairly well. So the interesting thing, I think, for me too, is that the choice of cinematographers and this sort of choice of a crew, really, how do you go about picking a crew when you're making a film that is a film that's sensitive, and I think a lot of important stuff going on in this particular project. So normally a producer would be there, or a director at least would be there. How do you, again, sort of have a presence on set in a way that is that you feel strongly that it's going to be respectful and you're going to get some sort of results? And so how do you do that? And looking for a good cameraman is something some of you out there might find yourself in a situation where you have to make that choice. My advice would be find somebody who has a good understanding of the subject, at least a good feeling for the subject. It's very important. And I feel that it's also important that the person that you choose to be your camera person, if it's in this area, is a person who behaves respectfully. It's very easy, especially when you're working with different cultures, to cross a culture, to make mistakes, and you need to be sort of on guard. It's okay to apologize afterwards after you make mistakes, but it's much better to avoid the mistake in the first place if you can. So it's a matter of kind of doing your homework, and your crew should be expected to do that as well. Technical competence is obviously important. In this case, technology seems to be getting simpler and simpler as it goes, which probably means it's getting more and more complex as it goes, because inside that little box there's a lot more going on. But technically competent, you want people to be able to solve technical problems when things happen. I like to work with a creative crew. Typically what we do is when we're shooting, we start off with an agenda, which the director or the producer will set. Once we get that, then it's a good idea to let your sound person or your cinematographer give them free rein, let them give you their ideas, see what they come up with. Always budget enough time for that to happen, and you'll get some nice surprises. Very often they'll see things that you have not seen, or they'll hear things that you haven't heard. It's important that they be affordable, and did you know what sort of costs there are up front, so you don't get yourself into a bottomless pit. Sometimes you can be in a situation where, certainly in Canada or Newfoundland, where the fog rolls in and you're stuck in the place for 5 days waiting for the fog to clear. That can cost you an awful lot of money, and it's a very good idea to have all of that worked out up front with your crew. Just a word of caution. And then finally, the attitude. A positive attitude, and I think a feeling of generosity is really helpful for anybody who's working with you in a creative sort of enterprise. So I don't know how I could go on with this, but all in all, I guess I'll start to wrap up. This was a particularly interesting project, partly because of the involvement with the university. The university brings a different kind of ethical position to the film, to a film process, than a filmmaker would normally have. Certainly with St. Mary's University, the ethical requirements were quite stringent. Rules were in place, and I guess that kind of changed the way I looked at things. Certainly, we have to worry about that when we make films, but not to the degree that a researcher maybe would face. And it was a bit of an eye opener for me. And again, respecting that position and sort of honoring it as we went was important to us, and I think we did that. So I guess I'll let it go at that. Hopefully, I stumble on something there that might be useful to you. Okay, thank you.
Well, in thanking Don Duchesne, I'd like to note that, of course, he's, lots of opportunity to ask questions of Don, and already I see some questions being posted. So really just a reminder for people to certainly go ahead and post those questions in the question and answer feature on Zoom at the bottom of your screen, and already we're seeing some pop up, and to post them while the presenters are speaking, because that's when the ideas already we've got some questions for Don. So I want to go on and introduce our next speaker, because Don really painted that picture of the geography and the reach of the communities and the efforts. And so joining us today from Cape Town, South Africa, Merle Selman, and certainly Merle can speak from her experience. And so I'll throw things over to Merle to now talk about how this project, the context for it in South Africa. Merle.
Thanks very much, and hello everybody. So so I'm going to talk a little bit and give a little bit of background on the Olifants River fisher community, and then I'm going to hand over to Nico, who's going to expand a little bit on some of the issues and some of the challenges that the communities are facing. So just to locate you, the Olifants Estuary is located on the west coast of South Africa. It's about 400 kilometers north of Cape Town. And there are a number of villages along the lower reaches of this estuary, and these people have become known as the fishers of Ebenezer and Papendorp, and they've been fishing in this estuary for many generations. And if you look at the archival record for this area, we note that these communities are descendants of indigenous hunter-fisher-gatherers that settled there long ago in the 17th century. But in about 1925, the governor of the Cape, at that time it was a self-governing territory under the British Empire, they instituted a land change under some sort of land change act, and that led to the forced relocation of these fishing communities to the lower reaches of the Olifants Estuary. And the soils in this area were extremely poor. And so these groups of people then turned to fishing as a main source of food and livelihood. And that livelihood strategy persists today. So they're relatively small settlements, about 1,300 households in a couple of villages, but about 120 of these households are very reliant on fishing as a source of food and as a contribution to their livelihood. And so we're really talking about a relatively poor community with high levels of unemployment, and many people in these communities totally reliant on social grants from government. And so I'm afraid to say the advent of democracy in 1994 has not really altered their socioeconomic circumstances. Although they have recently been awarded a land claim, which restores their rights to some of the lands lost in 1926, which will provide access to land and hopefully improve access to job opportunities. But this process, like so many, has been extremely slow and it's been fraught with difficulties. And as yet, we haven't seen any visible and tangible benefits in the community. So the people in Ebenezer and Papendorp, they've been fishing in this estuary using rowboats and gill nets for generations. And they mainly target a species of fish, a kind of mullet, and they catch some lionfish as well. But for many people, the estuary is much more than just a source of food and a form of livelihood. It represents much more. It represents an integral part of their lives, of who they are, of their culture, and of their identity. And, you know, when you speak to fishers, they'll often say things like, the river runs through my veins, or, you know, we come from the river. So they are very much, their lives are very much intertwined with this estuary. But from a biodiversity perspective, this Olifants estuary is one of the most important estuaries in South Africa from a conservation perspective. It boasts one of the largest areas of salt marsh that is relatively unspoilt, and it's an incredibly important area in terms of birding. And so whilst fishing in the estuary has been ongoing for decades, there is increasing evidence of changes in the environment. We're noticing things like, you know, less rain in the catchment. And so the drought is having an effect on water flow into the estuary. And there's a sanding up of the river mouth and an overall reduction in the mullet stocks out at sea, which is affecting fish catches in the estuary. And so it's really difficult to sustain a livelihood from fishing alone. So this community faces a lot of challenges and are confronted by a lot of really sort of challenging issues. And so I've been working with this fishing community for several years together with my various postgraduate students and NGO groups such as Masifundisi and the Legal Resources Center and now Abelobi on a range of issues and projects. I mean, we've worked with the fishing community to set up community-based monitoring systems, co-management arrangements with government for a period of time were successful. But more recently, our efforts and together with NGOs has been on working with the community to challenge conservation plans that propose to close the estuary completely to fishing by these local fishing communities. And more recently, to challenge an application to prospect and mine on the banks adjacent to the Olifants estuary. And so these are some of the burning challenges that I'm going to hand over to Nico, perhaps to talk more about, and of course, many other issues that they're facing.
Well, thank you very, very much, Merle. And I just wanted to mention again that Nico Waldeck is joining us from Lambert's Bay on the northwest coast of South Africa. So welcome, Nico, and certainly your talk will fit right where Merle left off. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Margaret and Merle. Looking at the film, I want to say thank you. You know, this film is stirring emotions in me. You know, it's bringing a kind of a sadness because in that film, the people that have passed away, they've come to life in that film. You know, I'm looking at Uncle Hansie, you know, who have lost his legs. They all, you know, they were so part of this, and it brings me to the struggle of these people, you know, my family. It's an ongoing struggle for their livelihoods. It is something that are being inherited by their children, because now I'm a witness of their parents' struggle, and now the children are struggle for the access rights to their livelihoods. You know, it's like an ongoing continuation of a struggle, and people that are forced to living in this mode of struggle, they can't prosper. You know, and that put so much pressure on the already declining stocks, you know, because now the parents have struggled for their livelihoods. The kids now have inherited that, which means then the next generation will also inherit the struggle of the parents for the upcoming generation, which means it leaves so less for that communities to look out. You know, the kids can't go to school, you know, colleges, universities, and becoming something. So those kids are being forced now by circumstances to look at the river for a living. You know, and some of these kids have lost respect because they've seen the exclusion of their parents from their livelihoods, you know, and they are going there and doing funny things, you know, things that they haven't learned from their parents, just to survive. So the other struggle is, you know, a community that are being together for so long. Now, because of the struggle for their livelihoods, now they are divided. They are separated. To each one is now fighting to survive on their own. So that's one of the biggest things for me about the struggle of the communities. The other thing, the struggle of those poor communities, it's like an add-on, you know. What's our fight for the fishers' rights, you know? Some of the fishers have received some high-value species, which are exported species, and now they are struggling to market access. They are being exploited because of this marketing of this products, you know, because they are kept in poverty, and now they have to accept, you know, advances before even the seasons of the high-value species started. So it's from one struggle to another struggle for these communities. So where I want to go with this is are there something that we are doing? Maybe we have to consider doing the other way around. And for me, is now with my job was Upper Lobby, I've learned that if you empower the fishers within the market, you know, in the way they are fishing and selling the fish, you are empowering them, then you enable a community to look after themselves. So maybe for moving forward, there's something we need to think about, to empower the communities in terms of the market with what they know. That's in short my input into this.
Well, thank you very much, Nico. And that was certainly very powerful. And now we're going to enter into that portion of this event where we invite our questions and answers, questions from our audience, again, using the Q&A feature at the bottom of Zoom. And Libby Dean, our researcher with certainly with CCRN, will help moderate this section by voicing some of the questions and pointing out the various panelists that are best equipped to answer. So Libby, I'm going to turn it over to you for the next, 20 minutes or so, and we'll see where we get to. And by all means, though, I see we have quite a few participants today, so please post your questions, and this will be a great conversation. We've already learned so much. Libby, over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. We do have some interesting questions coming in. I just want to remind people to use the Q&A button. Ideally, it's the best way for us to see it. And if you want to add your location or region and your angle and interest, that's fine. If you find that helpful, it might help us guide our answers a little bit more. So thank you very much. I'm going to start with a film question, just which came up earlier. For Dawn, is you were complimented in the question and answer about good continuity of look and sound, and one of the viewers wanted to know if that was a result of extensive editing and obviously your skill, but they had a couple of other questions about what you use. So I'll ask those and I can repeat them if you need me to. Did you do any shooting on smartphones? And what app or program do you use when you're editing?
Okay. No, we didn't shoot on smartphones. That's not to say that's not done, because I think more and more it is done, and more it will be done. We used a variety of equipment because we were shooting in different locations, and whereas you might ideally want to control that and shoot with the same system wherever you were, it wasn't possible for us to do that. So, but fortunately, the Edit Suite, that we're, I work with a very good editor, Dave Mullins, and Tony will back me up on this. Dave, when you look for the ideal person to work with in what I think of as this iterative process, Dave is great at that. He'll put together something very fast. You can look at something that is a work in progress, and you can sort of work with the things at that level, and then you can really bring your own ideas to it. So for me, it's more about the people than it is about the equipment. Most edit suites, whether you're working with an Avid suite or Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere, at the end of the day, they're all, not one of them is going to give you a good film unless you have an editor who's working with you. So to me, the editor in this film was really essential part of the team. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but Dave deserves the credit for continuity and flow more than anybody else, I think. So I'd like to take it myself, but I can't. Not really.
Thank you. I actually wanted to follow that by just asking Tony if he'd say something about the project that came out of this, documenting with video, which is sort of a side tool that many of the people who are watching today might find interesting. So I'll maybe have Tony address that, and then Don, if you'd like to add a little bit more about that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah. That well, it's very very relevant to the question, because the documenting with video series. So there's 3 short videos and a manual that are all downloadable or viewable on the communityconservation.net website. These were really prepared by Don along with Dave Mullins, and it's really a guide to how the aim is to empower, to provide a tool that along the lines that Nico was referring to, a tool that can help empower local communities to tell their stories. Well, local communities, but also academic researchers or non-governmental organizations, really anyone that's perhaps not necessarily a professional filmmaker. And I recall that in that series, Don makes the point that smartphones can be suitable, and it all depends what you have, what your budget is, and what you need to accomplish. So yes, again, documenting with videos on the website and freely available there.
Yeah. If I just pick up on that a little bit, I think our intention with that was to, as Tony said, to empower communities and people who may be reluctant storytellers to cross the bridge, give it a try. It's not as threatening as it, doesn't have to threaten you. It's something that you can do. So if you wanted to take 15 or 20 minutes to have a look at those resources on the website, maybe that would encourage you to sort of give it a go. The one thing that I would point out is that of all the things that that sort of go into making a film, the most common mistake I think would be with sound. And I think it's very important to consider a way to get good sound, just figure that one out. Images are oddly enough easier to come by, but if you don't have a good soundtrack, you're probably in trouble. So pay attention to that one. So I also just wanted to say thanks, Nico, I really appreciate it. I'm really glad to hear that there was an emotional response from somewhere, because it's very hard to make a film like this, which has got a lot of information that you really need to pass on, but to capture some kind of feeling, to at least get that was at least some of our audience was reassuring. It felt good. So thanks for saying that.
I'd like to address a question to Nico. I believe this would be excellent for you to start with. This question's coming to us from Brazil today. What are the challenges facing communities struggling against injustice and who need to have their voices heard on this movement?
Sure, it's about enable that community to voice their concerns. And then I have to thank Professor Merle and UCT to have creating an able environment for those communities to raise their voices, but also to organize those communities, because there's sometimes there's no funding available. This is remote communities, and that's one of the biggest struggles, to get to that communities and have a presence, a continued presence within that particular communities. So that's some of the key challenges of working in those remote communities. And the other one, the big one for me is the leadership within that communities. You start to develop leadership within the community, and for me it's like, you know, market forces, industries, they come and poach. I have to use this word. They poach those leaders with money and stuff like that, you know. And then you start again in that community, developing the leadership that can take the concerns of the community forward. That's some of the key challenges that communities are facing.
Thank you. I believe this would be wise to follow up possibly with Merle to start with. One of the questions that came in that says, did you find that people participating in the film had an expectation that sharing their experiences could result in an improvement in challenging conditions? I don't know if that feels like something you could address first, and maybe Dawn as well.
Yeah, I must say, I think when there's been a long-standing relationship in a community where you've worked in a community for a long time and you've built up relationships of trust and support, you know, so when one comes into a community and talks about making a movie and some of the rationale for that, I don't necessarily think that there were false expectations created in this case at all. I think one of the important things for this community is the sort of networking beyond the community, and through researchers, through NGOs, through things like the movie. I think that's part of them networking into a broader community. And I mean, of course, we would want them to have been part of this evening's presentation and discussion, and their rich voices would have really added to it. And as Tony says, hopefully there's going to be another occasion for that, because obviously it's difficult for them to connect on internet and so on. But I really think that things like this movie is part of communicating the message of the realities that local fishing communities are experiencing on the ground. And so I think there is value in that. And I must say, I think at times, you know, communities might feel, or in this case, our community that we work with might feel that, you know, by speaking to perhaps, you know, the outside world, or by speaking out, that potentially things might change and things might be better. But I don't feel where there are these long-standing relationships that one is necessarily creating false expectations.
Thank you. That question came to us from Mexico today. One of the other questions that's come up several times throughout this process is how were the 4 communities for the film chosen from this global network of community stories? Tony, could you answer that?
Well, that's a difficult one, and you know, it's also a kind of awkward one, I guess, because we've been working over the years with so many different communities around the world, and you know, as Merle said, the way the Community Conservation Research Network was structured is that that people on the research side in each of the locations have been working closely with communities for years, and so the network, the CCRN, is a bit of an amalgamation of these opportunities where the research side and the community side are working closely together in a whole range of locations. And you know, one of my lessons, I guess, as a researcher largely, and now as somebody doing some film work, is that, and hopefully Dawn can comment as well, that the realities of a film are a little bit different from the realities of a book, for example. We're actually producing a book at the moment that has a whole range of chapters in it, and includes 14 different community stories as part of that book. If we wanted to, it could be 15 or 20 or 30, but a film is a bit different. So it had to be limited in what could be covered. We tried to cover there's certain elements that we wanted to be sure were in there. We wanted both urban and rural communities to be reflected. So for example, in my home area, the Dartmouth North Food Center is an urban example of a community that's working together, linking environment and livelihoods. We wanted Indigenous involvement, and I'm very pleased that the Tlaquequit First Nation on the west coast of Canada, part of the Nachalnas Nation, was willing to be part of this. We're pleased who's in the film, but also I have a bit of sadness, I guess, in terms of who or what communities have perfectly exciting stories to tell, but aren't in the film. And again, I would suggest that looking at the CCRN website, there are videos of other specific cases that couldn't make it into this film. There's written stories as well, and so there's we're embracing and celebrating that range of stories. It's the ones in the movie are both a combination of budget and feasibility and balance.
Thank you.
I don't think I can add anything to that answer. I think that's a very good answer.
Okay. Well, we're soon going to be wrapping up the questions, and I'm hoping that Nico, you might take this one on. You spoke of people who have passed away and who fought an ongoing struggle for their livelihoods, and you referred to it as an inherited struggle. We're wondering also, do you feel there are some inherited victories in this struggle?
Indeed, one of the things is that the community are being able to stand together and voice up, something that they've learned from their parents and their grandparents, to speak against those injustices, to look for, communal solutions to some of their problems. So indeed, they for me, that's victories, where people start speaking. What was happening in Olifants, where they've come was the estuary management plans, where they want to exclude the community from fishing in that particular area, and then there was a mining application, and from excluding the community have become now the fighters or for the protection of the environment. So that was a kind of a victory for me, that the community have changed so quickly, from being excluded, now being the people and not the government fighting for the protection of their environment. That was a victory for me.
Well, thank you. I believe that if this were a PowerPoint presentation, that might have been what people call the sunset slide. So I really appreciate all of your answers to the different questions we got in. There are a few more questions, but I believe it's time for us to do our closing round. And please just remember to, if you're watching today, to look along the chat part of this webinar for some of the resources that we've been talking about. You, of course, may email us with additional questions, and we'd like to stay connected with you in the different ways that we can through our website and our other resources. Thank you.
Well, to do our closing today and really sum up, I'm going to ask Tony Charles to give us some concluding thoughts, because we do have about 5 minutes for those. So Tony, if you want to give us some concluding thoughts, that would be wonderful.
Well, thank you, Margaret. First of all, I would certainly encourage those that are taking part in the session today to, if you like the film, please circulate it widely anywhere you can think of. We'd like to get the film seen and thought about, and perhaps if we're really lucky, it might inspire some action in various parts of the world. We realize it's a film that's in English, and that limits things, but nevertheless, we hope that it will have some impact. So as the saying goes, if you like the film, send it around. If you didn't like it, then don't do anything. But to just to look broadly at what is going on with local communities around the world, I must say, without going into a long presentation, ever since in my part of Canada, just over 25 years ago, the major fishery in this area collapsed, the cod fishery, and it's become kind of an icon of poor decision making by governments. But for me, it was also an icon of wonderful actions by local communities all around the Atlantic side of Canada in response to that major environmental disaster. And so I know it inspired me to focus in on what local communities can accomplish. And I certainly, wasn't too early on in that, because Eleanor Ostrom and so many others, Fikret Berkus, one of our CCRN colleagues, and many others have been looking at that for years from a research point of view. And the communities themselves, one realizes that the communities themselves are taking action around the world, whether or not university researchers notice them, whether or not governments are supporting them. Action is going on, and I find that inspiring. So, our website, communityconservation.net, highlights some of that, but there's so much more out there, and indeed, wherever you are in the world, there are local communities doing wonderful things, and supporting those, to me, is something that we can all be part of. Thank you.
Well, it's my job to wrap things up, and I'd like to remind everybody that the links to the film on the CCRN website, and indeed, we've been recording today's live discussion, and I see so many accolades and praise coming in for the panelists for this project. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating, indeed to our panelists, to Tony, to Nico, to Merle, to Libby, to Dawn, and also to everyone from so many communities around the globe with us today. And with that, we'll conclude and say thank you and goodbye for now.